It was July 1969. Millions watched as man took his first step on the moon, but what the cameras did not show was what the astronauts saw when the feed went dark. Welcome to Hidden Index, where the past reveals what the present chose to forget. On July 20th, 1969, at 20 hours 17 minutes and 40 seconds Coordinated Universal Time, the lunar module Eagle touched down in the Sea of Tranquility. Neil Armstrong descended the ladder, his boot pressed into the lunar surface. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The world celebrated. Ticker tape parades filled the streets of New York. The Cold War had been won, at least in orbit. America had beaten the Soviet Union to the moon. The flag was planted. The samples were collected. The mission was perfect, but beneath the triumph, something else was unfolding. Something the public would not learn about for decades. The transmission from the moon that day was not seamless. During the descent, there was a period of approximately 2 minutes when communication between Mission Control in Houston and the lunar module went silent. Official records attribute this to a routine switching of antennas. The signal had to transfer from one ground station to another as the Earth rotated. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. But in the years that followed, former NASA employees, radio operators, and independent researchers began to speak about what they heard during those missing minutes. Some claimed that the astronauts reported seeing lights on the far side of a nearby crater. Others mentioned structures artificial in appearance, arranged in geometric patterns. These accounts were never verified. NASA dismissed them as fabrications, misinterpretations, or Cold War-era paranoia. The agency stated clearly that no such communication ever occurred, but the silence itself remained unexplained in any official capacity beyond the technical justification. Then, in 2006, NASA made an admission that sent shockwaves through the archival and scientific communities. The original telemetry tapes from Apollo 11, the raw data recordings that captured every heartbeat, every instrument reading, every word spoken between Armstrong, Aldrin, and Mission Control, had been lost. Not misplaced, not damaged, lost. According to the agency, the tapes had been accidentally erased and reused during a routine magnetic tape shortage in the early 1980s. The magnetic reels, which should have been preserved in the National Archives as some of the most significant artifacts of human exploration, were instead degaussed and repurposed for satellite data collection. When the agency attempted to locate the originals for restoration and transfer to modern formats, they were gone, vanished. The only records that remained were low-quality kinescope copies, recordings made by pointing a camera at a video monitor during the live broadcast. The fidelity was degraded, the data incomplete. The highest resolution documentation of humanity's first lunar landing no longer existed in its original form. This was not a minor administrative error. These tapes contained biometric data, high-resolution telemetry, backup audio channels, and potentially any anomalies or communications that did not make it into the public broadcast. Their disappearance raised a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. If NASA could lose the most important recordings in the history of space exploration, what else might have been erased, intentionally or otherwise? The answer to that question requires going back to the beginning. Not to 1969, but to the years before NASA even existed. To a time when the moon was not a destination for peaceful exploration, but a strategic military objective. To understand how such a thing could happen, one must go back further, before Apollo, before NASA itself. In 1959, the United States Army drafted a classified plan called Project Horizon. The objective was clear: establish a permanent military outpost on the moon by 1966. The proposal outlined a base capable of housing 12 personnel. It would serve as a surveillance station, a deterrent against Soviet aggression, and a strategic high ground in the event of nuclear war. The moon, from a military perspective, was the ultimate watchtower. Any nation controlling it could monitor the entire planet. Communications could be intercepted. Missile launches could be detected minutes earlier than from Earth-based systems. The project was ambitious. It was detailed. Engineers calculated the tonnage of supplies that would need to be delivered. Architects designed pressurized habitats. Military strategists outlined defensive capabilities in case Soviet forces attempted to establish their own presence. The plan was real, the intention was serious, but the funding never materialized, or rather, it was redirected. The focus shifted to the civilian space program under NASA. The public face of space exploration became one of peace, science, and international cooperation. But the documents remained classified for decades. When they were finally declassified, they revealed how seriously the United States government viewed the moon not as a symbol of peace and exploration, but as a potential theater of war. The question then becomes, did the military ambitions truly disappear, or did they simply go underground? The men who made the moon missions possible came from unexpected places. Wernher von Braun, the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that carried the Apollo astronauts into space, was a former member of the Nazi Party and an officer in the SS. He had been the technical director of the V-2 rocket program during World War II, a weapon that killed thousands in London and Antwerp. The V-2 was the world's first long-range ballistic missile. It was also built using forced labor from concentration camps. Thousands of prisoners died in the tunnels beneath the Harz Mountains, assembling rockets that would rain down on Allied cities. Von Braun was present at these facilities. He was aware of the conditions. After the war, as Allied forces closed in on Germany, von Braun made a calculated decision. He surrendered to American troops rather than Soviet forces. He knew what he had to offer: technology, expertise, the future of rocketry, and the United States wanted it. Von Braun and more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States under a program called Operation Paperclip. The operation was a joint effort by the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency, and the United States military. The objective was to prevent Soviet forces from capturing German technological expertise. Many of these scientists had war crime records. Some had used slave labor in concentration camps. Their pasts were sanitized. Their files were altered. Intelligence officers literally went through personnel dossiers with paperclips, removing incriminating documents and replacing them with cleaned-up versions. Hence the name. In exchange for immunity and American citizenship, they would build rockets for the United States. Von Braun became the face of the American space program. He appeared on television with Walt Disney explaining the wonders of space travel to children. He briefed presidents. He was celebrated as a visionary, but his past was never fully reconciled. The rockets that took humanity to the moon were built on the foundations of wartime terror, and the culture of secrecy, of compartmentalization, of doing whatever was necessary to achieve the mission, came with them. This context matters because it establishes a pattern. From the beginning, the space program was intertwined with secrecy, military interests, and a willingness to obscure uncomfortable truths in service of a larger objective. When NASA was created in 1958, it inherited not just the technology, but the culture of compartmentalization that came with it. Information was divided, projects were siloed. Even within the agency, engineers working on propulsion systems did not always know what the guidance teams were doing. This was by design. It protected sensitive information. It also made it easier to keep secrets. And there were secrets to keep, not just about technology, but about what might be found once humanity actually reached the moon. By the time Apollo 11 launched, NASA had perfected the art of managing public perception. The live broadcast from the moon was a carefully orchestrated event. The camera angles were planned. The dialogue was rehearsed. Armstrong and Aldrin had scripts. They knew what to say and when to say it. There was a speech prepared for President Richard Nixon in the event that Armstrong and Aldrin were stranded on the lunar surface and could not return. The speech was written by William Safire, a presidential speechwriter. It began, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." The document was filed away, never delivered. But its existence demonstrated how much was anticipated, controlled, and prepared for every possible outcome, except perhaps for what the astronauts might encounter that was not in the mission manual, and there were encounters. Small ones, unexplained ones, things that were noted in private communications but never made it into the official record. During the Apollo 11 mission, after the lunar module landed but before Armstrong stepped onto the surface, there was a period of time when the astronauts were supposed to rest. Mission Control recommended a sleep period. Armstrong and Aldrin were exhausted, but they did not sleep. They looked out the window, and according to some accounts, they saw something. A light, not from the sun, not from Earth. A light that moved across the horizon and then disappeared. They reported it on a private channel. The communication was logged but never released. Years later, when researchers filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the complete mission transcripts, that section was redacted. The reason given was that it contained technical data related to national security, but the redaction covered less than a minute of conversation. What could have been said in less than a minute that was still classified decades later? Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, would later make a curious statement during a public appearance. He was asked about the possibility of life elsewhere in the solar system. His response was unexpected. He mentioned a monolith on Phobos, one of the moons of Mars. He described it as a very unusual structure, something that appeared artificial. He suggested that if people wanted to know if there was intelligent life elsewhere, they should go visit the Martian moon and examine the object themselves. The comment was brief, it was not elaborated upon, but it was on record. Aldrin, a man who had stood on the surface of another world, was publicly acknowledging the existence of something that defied natural explanation. NASA never issued a clarification. The monolith on Phobos, later imaged by Soviet and European spacecraft, remains an oddity. It is likely a boulder, ejected from an impact crater and caught in an unusual position. But the fact that Aldrin chose to mention it at all suggested a comfort with discussing the strange and unexplained, something not typically associated with the disciplined, protocol-driven culture of NASA astronauts. It suggested that perhaps he had seen things that made him reconsider what was possible. Neil Armstrong, for his part, became increasingly reclusive after the moon landing. He gave few interviews. He avoided the spotlight. He resigned from NASA in 1971 and took a teaching position at the University of Cincinnati, where he remained for most of his life. He turned down endorsement deals. He refused to sign autographs. He became, in essence, a ghost. In one of his rare public speeches delivered at the White House on the 25th anniversary of Apollo 11, he made a statement that many found cryptic. He spoke of there being places to go beyond belief, breakthroughs available to those who could remove truth's protective layers. The phrasing was unusual, truth's protective layers. It suggested something hidden, something deliberately obscured. Armstrong did not elaborate, he never clarified what he meant. The speech was brief, filled with metaphor, and left many in the audience wondering what exactly he was referring to. Some interpreted it as a poetic reflection on the nature of exploration. Others believed he was hinting at knowledge that had been kept from the public. Armstrong passed away in 2012. He took whatever he meant with him. The Apollo missions faced a genuine and dangerous challenge that was rarely discussed in public broadcasts: the Van Allen radiation belts. These are zones of intense radiation trapped by Earth's magnetic field, extending from roughly 1,000 kilometers to 60,000 kilometers above the surface. Any spacecraft leaving Earth for the moon had to pass through them. The belts contain high-energy protons and electrons capable of damaging both electronics and human tissue. NASA engineers were well aware of the risk. The solution was speed and shielding. The Apollo spacecraft passed through the thinnest parts of the belts at high velocity, minimizing exposure time. The command module's aluminum hull, combined with the equipment and supplies stored along the walls, provided some shielding. The astronauts received a radiation dose, but it was within acceptable limits, roughly equivalent to a chest X-ray. However, internal memos and technical reports from the era showed significant concern among engineers. Some questioned whether the shielding was adequate. Others worried about solar flares, which could have delivered lethal doses of radiation if they occurred during the mission. The risk was real. It was managed, but it was never eliminated. Decades later, skeptics would point to the Van Allen belts as evidence that the moon landings were faked, arguing that no human could survive the passage. NASA released detailed explanations, radiation measurements, and dose calculations to counter these claims. But the fact that the danger was downplayed in public communications at the time contributed to the perception that the agency was more interested in managing optics than being transparent about risk. And if they were willing to downplay one danger, what else might they have minimized or hidden entirely? The Apollo 12 mission, which launched in November 1969, encountered its own set of anomalies. Shortly after liftoff, the Saturn V rocket was struck by lightning, twice. The electrical systems in the command module went haywire. Alarms blared, instruments failed. For a moment, mission control considered aborting the mission. But the crew, Commander Charles Conrad, Command Module Pilot Richard Gordon, and Lunar Module Pilot Alan Bean, remained calm. They reset the systems. The rocket continued its ascent. The mission proceeded. But what was not widely reported was what happened after they reached the moon. During their second moonwalk, Conrad and Bean deployed a series of scientific instruments known as the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package. These instruments were designed to measure seismic activity, solar wind, and the lunar magnetic field. One of the instruments, a magnetometer, began recording data immediately, and the data was strange. It showed fluctuations in the magnetic field that should not have been there. The moon has no global magnetic field. It is geologically dead, but the readings suggested localized magnetic anomalies, as if something beneath the surface was generating a field. The data was transmitted back to Earth. Scientists analyzed it. They found no natural explanation. The anomalies persisted for the duration of the mission and then stopped. When the astronauts returned, they were debriefed. They were asked if they had seen anything unusual. They said no, but the data remained, and it was never fully explained. After Apollo 17 in December 1972, the manned moon missions stopped. There were plans for Apollo 18, 19, and 20. Hardware had been built, rockets were ready, astronauts were trained, but the missions were canceled. The official reason was budget cuts. The Vietnam War was consuming resources. Public interest in the moon landings had waned. The final 3 missions were deemed too expensive to justify. The Saturn V production line was shut down. The plans were shelved, but some researchers found the timing suspicious. At the height of technological capability, with infrastructure already in place, the United States simply walked away from the moon. No other nation has sent astronauts there since. The Soviet Union never succeeded in its own manned lunar program. Their N-1 rocket, the equivalent of the Saturn V, failed in all 4 of its test flights. The program was abandoned in 1974. China and India have sent robotic missions, but no human has set foot on the lunar surface in over 50 years. The question lingers: if the moon was truly just a barren rock, why not continue? Why not establish a research station? Why abandon the capability entirely? One answer, often dismissed but persistently discussed in certain circles, involves a rumored mission called Apollo 20. According to this theory, a classified mission was launched in August 1976, years after the public program ended. The objective was to investigate an anomaly photographed during earlier orbital missions. The images, allegedly taken by Apollo 15, showed a long, cylindrical object partially buried in a crater on the far side of the moon. The object was described as several kilometers in length, with features that appeared too regular to be natural. The Apollo 20 mission, if it occurred, was said to have been a joint operation between the United States and the Soviet Union, a secret collaboration during the height of the Cold War. The crew supposedly included American astronaut William Rutledge, Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov, and another American pilot whose identity was never revealed. Rutledge later claimed in online interviews posted on YouTube in 2007 that they found the object, entered it, and discovered the remains of an ancient extraterrestrial pilot. He described the interior as vast, with corridors and chambers. He said they recovered artifacts, including what appeared to be a navigation system. The story is almost certainly a hoax. No mission records exist. The images have been debunked as misidentifications or digital fabrications. NASA has never acknowledged Apollo 20. William Rutledge was a real person, but he was never an astronaut. He was a civilian test pilot who worked for Bell Aircraft, but the persistence of the story reflects a deeper distrust. People wanted to believe that there was more to the moon than what they were told. And in the absence of transparency, the void was filled with speculation. What is documented, however, is NASA's approach to lunar imagery. The lunar orbiter missions, which preceded Apollo, captured thousands of high-resolution photographs of the moon's surface. These images were used to select landing sites and map the terrain, but researchers analyzing the photos noticed something unusual. Some images appeared to have been altered, not in dramatic ways, but in subtle adjustments. Brightness levels were changed, certain features were obscured. In some cases, objects that appeared in preliminary prints were missing from the final published versions. Photo analysts, including those who had worked for intelligence agencies, examined the negatives and found evidence of airbrushing. NASA explained this as standard enhancement, a way to improve image clarity for scientific analysis. But the alterations were inconsistent. Some regions of the moon were enhanced, others were obscured. When pressed, the agency provided technical justifications but refused to release all of the original, unprocessed images. Even today, much of the raw data from the lunar orbiter missions remains inaccessible to the public. It is stored in archives, restricted or deteriorated beyond recovery. The question becomes, what was being hidden? Were the alterations truly just for clarity, or were they removing something that should not have been there? One former NASA contractor, speaking anonymously in the late 1990s, claimed that she had been tasked with airbrushing lunar photographs. She worked in the photographic processing division during the Apollo era. Her job was to clean up images before they were released to the public. She described the process as routine. Most of the time, it involved removing lens flares, correcting exposure, and sharpening details. But on several occasions, she was given images that contained objects that did not fit, geometric shapes, structures that appeared artificial. She was instructed to remove them. She did not ask questions. She did her job. Years later, she expressed regret. She said she did not know if what she was removing was real or if it was an artifact of the imaging process. But she remembered the images, and she remembered being told that they were classified. Her testimony was never corroborated. She provided no physical evidence, but her account matched the observations of other researchers who had analyzed the lunar orbiter photographs. In more recent years, other nations have begun their own lunar exploration programs, and some of their findings have been equally puzzling. China's Chang'e orbiter, launched in 2010, captured images of the moon in unprecedented detail. The resolution was 7 meters per pixel, far superior to anything NASA had released publicly from the Apollo era. Researchers analyzing the data reported unusual light anomalies near certain craters, particularly on the far side. These were not reflections or camera artifacts. They appeared to be localized sources of illumination in regions that should have been in complete shadow. The far side of the moon, the side that never faces Earth, is one of the most mysterious regions in the solar system. It is heavily cratered, it has thicker crust, and it is shielded from Earth-based observation. Anything there would be invisible unless a spacecraft was directly overhead. China's space agency did not provide an explanation for the light anomalies. The images were published in scientific journals, noted and then quietly set aside, but the data was there, lights in the darkness, with no apparent source. India's Chandrayaan missions similarly detected unexpected signals. The Chandrayaan-1 orbiter, launched in 2008, identified water molecules on the lunar surface, a significant discovery. But it also recorded brief bursts of radio frequency emissions from specific locations. These signals did not match any known natural phenomenon. They were too regular, too structured. Indian scientists proposed that they might be related to solar-wind interactions or subsurface mineral deposits. But the data was inconclusive. The signals appeared, persisted for a short time, and then vanished. When Chandrayaan-2 arrived in 2019, it attempted to relocate the signal sources. Some were found again, others were not. The pattern was inconsistent, and no definitive explanation was ever provided. These modern findings have revived old questions. If the moon is geologically dead with no atmosphere, no magnetic field, and no tectonic activity, where are these signals coming from? If the light anomalies are not reflections, what is generating them? And why, after more than 50 years, do we still not have clear answers? The moon has been studied more intensely than any other celestial body except Earth. We have mapped its surface, we have analyzed its rocks, we have measured its gravitational field, and yet anomalies persist. Data that does not fit, observations that defy easy explanation. The scientific community tends to attribute these to natural but poorly understood processes, but the lack of definitive answers leaves room for doubt. The moon has always been a place of projection. Throughout history, it has been a symbol of the divine, the unreachable, the mysterious. Ancient civilizations worshipped it, poets wrote about it, scientists studied it, and when humanity finally reached it, the mystery did not disappear. It deepened because the closer we looked, the more inconsistencies appeared, not in the science. The physics of the moon is well understood. Its composition, its orbit, its formation are all documented and explained. But the narrative, the story we have been told about what happened there, has gaps. Some of those gaps are explained by bureaucracy, by lost records, by the chaos of managing the largest technological undertaking in human history. But others remain unexplained. Consider the broader context of the Cold War. The space race was not about discovery, it was about dominance. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957 and the United States panicked. The fear was not just about prestige, it was about capability. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead there too. The moon became the next frontier, not because it was scientifically valuable, but because it was symbolically and strategically critical. Whoever controlled space controlled the future. That was the logic. And within that logic, secrecy was not just expected, it was mandatory. If something unexpected was found on the moon, something that could shift the balance of power or challenge the existing narrative, would it have been disclosed? Or would it have been classified, studied in secret, and filed away in a vault? The answer, based on how the government handled other sensitive information during that era, is clear. It would have been hidden. The Pentagon Papers, the Watergate scandal, the Church Committee revelations about CIA operations. All of these showed a pattern of information being withheld from the public in the name of national security. Why would the moon be any different? There is no definitive evidence that anything extraterrestrial or artificial was discovered on the moon. No smoking gun, no leaked document that has withstood rigorous scrutiny. But there are patterns. Patterns of erasure, of redaction, of missing data and inconclusive explanations. The lost telemetry tapes, the radio silence, the altered photographs, the sudden end of manned missions, the cryptic statements from astronauts. Individually, each of these can be explained. Collectively, they form a mosaic of doubts, and that doubt is reinforced by the behavior of those who were there. The astronauts who walked on the moon did not, for the most part, become advocates for returning. They did not push for continued exploration. Some, like Armstrong, withdrew from public life entirely. Others, like Aldrin, spoke in riddles. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon during Apollo 14, became an outspoken advocate for the existence of extraterrestrial life. He claimed that governments around the world were aware of alien visitation and were covering it up. He provided no evidence, but he spoke with conviction. He said that his time on the moon had changed him, that he had seen and experienced things that made him question everything he had been taught. Mitchell passed away in 2016. Like Armstrong, he took his full story with him, and then there is the question of why we have not returned. Technology has advanced exponentially since the 1970s. Computing power that once filled entire rooms now fits in a pocket. Materials science, propulsion systems, life support, all of it is far superior to what was available during Apollo. Private companies are now developing lunar landers. International space agencies have proposed permanent moon bases, and yet no human has returned. The official reason remains cost. A manned mission to the moon is expensive, and the scientific return does not justify the investment when robotic probes can do much of the work. But the cost argument is harder to sustain when billions are being spent on Mars missions, space telescopes, and orbital infrastructure. If the goal is exploration, the moon is the obvious next step. It is close, it is accessible, it could serve as a proving ground for deeper space missions. So why the hesitation? Why does every proposed return to the moon get delayed, defunded, or redesigned? Some former NASA contractors and engineers, speaking anonymously, have suggested that there were recommendations made at the highest levels to avoid the moon. Not because it was dangerous, but because of what might be found there, or what might already be there. These claims are unverified. They exist in the gray zone between rumor and testimony, but they persist. And they add to the sense that the moon is not just a dead rock, it is a locked room, and someone somewhere chose not to open the door. Or perhaps the door was opened once and what was found inside was deemed too destabilizing to reveal. The Cold War was built on mutually assured destruction, on the balance of power maintained by nuclear arsenals and the threat of annihilation. If something was discovered on the moon that disrupted that balance, that suggested humanity was not alone, that implied intelligences far beyond our own, the implications would have been catastrophic. Not militarily, philosophically, psychologically. The entire framework of human civilization, built on the assumption that we are the pinnacle of intelligence in the universe, would have been shattered. And in the middle of the Cold War, with the world teetering on the edge of nuclear war, that kind of revelation would have been unthinkable. So the missions stopped. The data was locked away. The astronauts were debriefed and told to remain silent, and the public was given a sanitized version of history. A version where humanity went to the moon, planted a flag, collected some rocks, and came home. A version where the universe remained empty and indifferent. A version that could be understood and accepted without questioning the foundations of everything we believed. But the cracks in that version have been visible from the beginning. And as more time passes, as more data is declassified, as more insiders come forward, the cracks widen. The moon is still there, silent, watching, waiting, and the truth, whatever it is, remains buried beneath the dust of the sea of tranquility. The moon may be lifeless, but the truth buried there still casts a shadow over everything we were told to believe. This was Hidden Index. Subscribe and uncover more stories the world was never meant to know.